Mental health is something we both care deeply about. And back in 2016, we launched Heads Together.
The committees had met. Behind closed doors, they had the conversations. The decision felt settled, and then Catherine walked in and changed everything. There was no drama, public campaign, or headlines warning. Just a quiet, calculated move that left palace insiders completely stunned. The Princess of Wales just claimed control of one of the most significant royal initiatives in years. And the people who thought they had already won, they never saw her coming. The initiative that changed everything. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something unexpected happens. Not the comfortable silence of an agreement, or the peaceful quiet of a decision well made. The sharp, loaded kind. The kind where everyone in the room is thinking the same thing, but nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. That was the silence inside the palace when the news broke internally. Catherine had won. But before we get to that moment, we need to talk about what she actually won. Because without understanding the initiative at the center of this story, none of what follows makes sense. For years, the Royal Foundation has been the vehicle through which William and Catherine channeled their most personal causes. Early years development, mental health awareness, environmental sustainability. These were not just passion projects, they were carefully constructed pillars of a long-term royal strategy. A strategy designed to show the British public and the world that the monarchy was not just a ceremonial relic, that it had a purpose and direction. But there was one initiative sitting at the intersection of all three pillars. One project that had the potential to define an entire generation of royal influence. It touched childhood development. It addressed mental health at the community level. It had the backing of some of the most powerful institutional partners the palace had ever worked with. Government bodies, private sector giants, international health organizations. This was not a ribbon-cutting exercise. It was real, substantial. The kind of thing that, if handled correctly, could cement a legacy. And that is precisely why everyone wanted a piece of it. Inside the palace, the jostling for position had been going on for months. Quietly, of course. This is the British royal family. Nobody shouts or sends aggressive emails. Nobody calls a press conference to declare their ambitions. Instead, things happen in meetings that are not officially meetings. In conversations that are framed as casual, but are anything but. In the careful placement of certain names on certain documents at certain times. Multiple factions had been circling this initiative. Senior courtiers saw it as a vehicle for institutional prestige. Advisors aligned with other members of the royal family who wanted the credit without necessarily doing the work. Even well-meaning external partners had begun to assume they would have a leading role simply because nobody had told them otherwise. It was, in the language of palace insiders, a fluid situation, which is a very polite way of saying it was a mess. The initiative had been in development for the better part of 2 years. Research had been commissioned, reports had been written, consultations had taken place with specialists across education, psychology, and public health. The groundwork was thorough, and the vision was compelling. What was missing was clear ownership. A single person or office with the authority and the credibility to take it from planning into execution. And here is where things get interesting. Because the assumption, shared by almost everyone involved, was that this decision would be made the way most palace decisions are made, slowly, through consensus, with the outcome shaped more by institutional inertia than by any single act of will. That assumption turned out to be wrong. What nobody had fully accounted for was Catherine herself. Her patience and preparation, the quiet, methodical way she had spent years building exactly the kind of credibility that this moment required. This was not a woman who had stumbled into a position of influence. This was someone who had done the work, who had sat with researchers and read the studies. She had visited the programs and asked the uncomfortable questions that polished royal visits do not usually accommodate. Catherine had built genuine relationships with practitioners in the field. Not just the directors and the donors, but the people actually delivering services on the ground. By the time the question of ownership over this initiative came to a head, Catherine was not simply a candidate. She was the most qualified person in the room, by a significant distance. But qualification alone does not win battles inside institutions like this one. The palace is not a meritocracy. It never has been. Seniority matters. Relationships matter. The unspoken hierarchies that have been in place for decades matter enormously. And there were people in those hierarchies who were not particularly enthusiastic about the Princess of Wales, especially seeing her expand her sphere of influence in such a visible and consequential way. So, why did she win? That question has more than one answer, and some of those answers are still being whispered about in the corridors. What is clear is this. In the weeks leading up to the decision, something shifted. The external partners, the organizations whose cooperation would be essential to making this initiative work, began signaling their preference, not publicly, or in any way that could be characterized as lobbying, but their signals were clear enough to anyone paying attention. They wanted Catherine, not because of her title, and definitely not because of the photographs, goodwill, and the favorable press coverage that comes with royal association, but because they had worked with her. They had seen how she operated. They trusted her judgment. They believed she understood what this initiative was actually trying to do and why it mattered. When that signal reached the right ears inside the palace, the dynamic changed. The fluid situation became considerably less fluid, and the people who had assumed this was already decided in their favor began to realize, with dawning unease, that perhaps it was not. The question now was how Catherine had managed to get to this point, without anyone realizing what she was doing until it was already done. That story starts much earlier than most people think. Catherine's long game. Nobody becomes this powerful by accident. That is the first thing you need to understand about Catherine, Princess of Wales. The woman who just stunned the palace did not wake up one morning and decide to make a move. This was not impulse. It was not opportunism. It was the result of years of deliberate, patient, almost invisible work that most people completely underestimated. And that underestimation, it was her greatest advantage. Let's go back, because the story of how Catherine won this moment begins long, way before anyone was paying attention to this particular initiative. It begins with a younger woman exploring one of the most scrutinized entries into public life in modern history. A woman who was watched, photographed, analyzed, and frequently underestimated by the very institution she was joining. When Catherine married Prince William in April 2011, the expectations placed on her were both enormous and strangely limited. Enormous in the sense that the world was watching. Limited in the sense that what the world expected from her was largely ceremonial. She was expected to look beautiful and smile graciously. She was also meant to represent the crown without causing controversy. Be the steady, reassuring presence beside the future king. She did all of that. But she was also doing something else entirely. She was learning, not in any dramatic or obvious way, or in a way that generated headlines or attracted attention. Quietly, systematically, she was studying how the institution worked. She was studying who held real influence and who merely appeared to, which causes had genuine impact and which were simply well photographed. How decisions actually got made inside the palace versus how they were presented to the outside world. This education took years, and Catherine approached it with the same discipline she had applied to everything else in her life. By the time she began developing what would become her signature focus, the early years agenda, she had already done something remarkable. She had moved from being seen primarily as William's wife to being recognized as a serious thinker in her own right. That shift did not happen overnight. It happened through hundreds of engagements, visits, conversations, and commissions that most people barely noticed at the time. The early years' work is worth examining closely here, because it was not simply a cause Catherine adopted. It was a masterclass in how to build institutional credibility from the ground up. She did not arrive at the early years agenda with a glossy campaign and a launch event. She arrived at it through research, through conversations with neuroscientists, developmental psychologists, and social workers and teachers. She got there through visits to programs in communities where the outcomes of early childhood development were not abstract statistics but lived realities. She commissioned independent research. She asked questions that made experts sit up and take notice. Not the polished questions of a patron reading from a briefing note, but the specific probing questions of someone who had genuinely done the reading. The 5 Big Questions report, the Shaping Us campaign, the work with the Royal Foundation Center for Early Childhood. These were not vanity projects. They were the building blocks of something larger. Each one added another layer of credibility, another relationship with another serious institution. Another signal to the people who pay attention to these things that Catherine was not simply lending her name to a cause, she was driving it. And while all of this was happening, she was also exploring something considerably more complicated. The years between 2018 and 2020 were among the most turbulent in recent royal history. The relationship between the Cambridges and the Sussexes deteriorated in ways that played out, painfully and publicly, across front pages around the world. The palace was destabilized, attention was fractured, the institution was consumed by a crisis of narrative that it struggled to manage. Catherine stayed focused. That sounds simple. It was not. The pressure during that period to engage, respond, and take sides either publicly or privately was immense. The media wanted a reaction. The public wanted drama. There were factions within the palace itself that had strong opinions about how things should be handled and who should be saying what. Catherine said almost nothing. She kept working, showing up and building. In retrospect, that discipline during the most chaotic period was perhaps the most important thing she did. While others around her were consumed by the turbulence, she was quietly accumulating something invaluable: a reputation for steadiness, for discretion, for keeping her eye on the long term when everything around her was short-term noise. By the time the monarchy faced its next great challenge, the illness of King Charles, Catherine had become something the palace needed urgently. A figure of genuine public trust, not manufactured trust. It was not the kind that comes from careful media management alone. The kind that is built through years of showing up, doing the work, and being consistent when consistency is hard. Her own health challenges in 2024 added another dimension that nobody could have predicted. The way she handled her cancer diagnosis generated a wave of public sympathy and respect, one that transcended the usual dynamics of royal popularity. People who had been indifferent to her before found themselves moved. People who had been skeptical found themselves reconsidering. She came back with something she had not quite had before: moral authority. And inside the palace, moral authority is not a soft concept. It is currency. Real, spendable currency that can be deployed in exactly the kinds of conversations that determine who controls what and why. So, when the question of ownership over this major initiative came to the surface, Catherine was not simply well-positioned. She was the only person in the room who brought everything the initiative needed: the subject matter expertise built over more than a decade, the relationships with external partners who trusted her judgment, the public credibility that would make the initiative land differently than it would under any other name, and the moral authority that made it very difficult for anyone inside the palace to mount a serious opposition, without looking like they were opposing something the public already believed in. The long game had been playing out for years. Most people just had not been watching closely enough to see it, but someone had noticed, and that someone had decided that the time had come to make things considerably more difficult for Catherine before she could cross the finish line. The resistance she faced. Every palace has its gatekeepers, people whose entire identity is built around controlling access, information, and outcomes. They do not appear in official photographs or give interviews. People like that don't have titles that mean anything to the outside world. But inside the institution, they are the ones who decide which ideas move forward, and which ones quietly disappear into a filing cabinet somewhere never to be seen again. Catherine was about to run directly into them. And what made this particular collision so fascinating was how it unfolded. Because this was not a dramatic confrontation. There were no raised voices in grand rooms, no letters written in anger, no factions declaring themselves openly. That is not how the palace operates. The palace is allergic to openness. It prefers its conflicts the way it prefers its carpets: thick, muffled, and very difficult to see through. What Catherine faced was something far more insidious than open opposition. She faced the quiet kind. The first sign came through scheduling. Suddenly, meetings that should have included her office were being arranged without the relevant invitations going out. Briefing documents that touched on the initiative were being circulated to certain parties, but not others. Consultation processes that Catherine's team had been actively involved in began to develop a curious habit. The habit of reaching conclusions before her representatives had a chance to contribute. None of this was accidental. This was a pressure campaign conducted entirely through bureaucratic means, deniable at every step, attributable to administrative oversight if anyone raised a complaint, but deliberate in its design and its intent. The message being sent, without anyone having to actually say it, was simple. You are not as central to this as you think you are. Now, here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Because the people running this campaign had made a calculation. They assumed that Catherine, faced with this kind of friction, would do what many people in her position would do. She would raise the issue through official channels. She would push back formally. She would make her displeasure known in ways that could then be characterized as difficult behavior, seen as overreach or as a senior royal throwing her weight around inappropriately. They were waiting for her to overreact. She did not give them the satisfaction. Instead, Catherine did something that those closest to her say is entirely characteristic, but that her opponents consistently failed to anticipate. She slowed down and got quieter. She became more methodical. While the pressure campaign was running its course, she was doing something her opponents were not. She was documenting everything, building a paper trail that was not aggressive or accusatory, but simply thorough. A clear, detailed record of her office's involvement, contributions, and her relationships with its external partners, and the timeline of how things had developed. She was building a case, not for a confrontation, for a conversation that she intended to control entirely. There was a moment, people familiar with the situation have suggested, when it genuinely looked like the resistance might work. A key external partner, one whose support was considered essential to the credibility of the entire initiative, was approached by a rival faction. The approach was subtle. A lunch here, a private briefing there, a carefully worded suggestion that the initiative might be better served by a different kind of leadership. Someone with, perhaps, a broader institutional perspective. That is a palace code for someone we can control more easily. The external partner listened politely. They asked thoughtful questions. They gave nothing away. And then, quietly, they picked up the phone and called someone in Catherine's office. That phone call changed everything, because what Catherine's team learned from that conversation was not just that a rival faction was actively working against her. It was the specific nature of the arguments being made, the particular concerns being raised, and the precise language being used to frame the case against her. Information is power in any institution. Inside the palace, it is almost the only power that matters. Armed with what she now knew, Catherine adjusted her approach with a precision that left her opponents flat-footed. She did not confront the rival faction directly. She did not expose what she had learned. She simply began addressing the concerns they had been raising privately and publicly, and through the right channels, before those concerns could be used as formal objections. One by one, the arguments against her were neutralized before they could be deployed. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of institutional maneuvering. But there was still one more obstacle that Catherine had not fully anticipated. And this one was considerably more personal than a group of palace courtiers playing procedural games. Within the broader royal family, there were sensitivities around the question of Catherine's expanding influence. Not hostile sensitivities necessarily, but the kind of quiet unease that surfaces when a balance of power that has been stable for years begins to shift. Other members of the family had their own relationships with the initiative's external partners, their own ideas about how it should be developed, and their own expectations about where their influence began and where Catherine's ended. Exploring this required a completely different set of skills. The bureaucratic obstruction she had handled through patience and documentation. The rival factions she had neutralized through information and precision. But family dynamics inside the House of Windsor operate according to their own entirely unique logic. A logic shaped by decades of protocol, personal history, and the kind of unspoken understandings that outsiders rarely get to see. Catherine handled it through what people close to her describe as radical deference. She did not assert herself in these conversations. She listened and acknowledged. She made clear, repeatedly and sincerely, that the initiative's success was the only thing that mattered, and that she had no interest in anyone feeling sidelined or diminished. She brought people in rather than closing them out. She found roles that felt meaningful rather than marginal. She made her allies feel like collaborators rather than supporters. It was a remarkable performance, not in a cynical sense. Those who witnessed it describe it as genuinely gracious, but it was also strategically brilliant. Because by the time the formal decision about ownership was approaching, Catherine had done something almost unheard of in palace politics. She had neutralized her opposition without making a single enemy. The courtiers who had run the pressure campaign against her had nothing left to deploy. The rival factions' arguments had already been addressed. The family sensitivities had been smoothed over with care and genuine consideration. The path was clear, but clearing a path and actually walking it are two different things entirely. And what happened next was the moment nobody inside the palace will forget in a hurry. The moment she won. There are moments in any institution that everyone present remembers exactly where they were when it happened. This was one of those moments. The meeting had been arranged with the kind of careful, deliberate neutrality that the palace specializes in. No agenda item that explicitly named what was actually being decided. There was no documentation that would later serve as evidence of how contested the process had been. Just a gathering of the relevant parties in one of those quietly grand rooms that the palace has in abundance, majorly to reach a final determination on the question of leadership over the initiative. On paper, it looked routine. It was anything but. The people in that room represented months of maneuvering, competing interests, and barely concealed ambition. Some of them had spent considerable energy trying to ensure this meeting would go a particular way. Some of them had made commitments privately to parties outside the palace about what the outcome would be. Some of them walked in genuinely believing that the decision had already been made and that this gathering was essentially a formality. Catherine walked in last, not late, precisely on time, but last. And the people who were there say that something shifted in the room the moment she entered, not because of anything dramatic. It was not because of a grand entrance or a commanding statement, simply because of the way she carried herself. Calm, unhurried, completely at ease in a room full of people who had spent months trying to make things difficult for her. She sat down and opened a folder, and she waited. The meeting began with the usual palace choreography, pleasantries, a brief recap of the initiative's development, a summary of where things stood, the kind of procedural warm-up that gives everyone in the room a few minutes to settle, and that gives those running the meeting the illusion of control over its direction. Then the question of leadership was raised, and here is where Catherine did something that nobody in that room had expected. She spoke first. Not aggressively or with the energy of someone staking a claim, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had already done the work and simply needed to remind the room of that fact. She laid out, methodically and without a single unnecessary word, the case for her office, taking ownership of the initiative, the research her team had commissioned, and the relationships they had built with external partners, the framework they had developed for moving from planning into execution. She also laid the timeline they had mapped out, the outcomes they were committed to delivering, and how those outcomes would be measured. It took 12 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of disagreement, the particular quiet that falls when something has been said so completely and so well that there is genuinely nothing left to add. One of the senior courtiers who had been most active in the pressure campaign against her attempted a response. He raised a concern about institutional oversight. He talked about the importance of ensuring the initiative maintained broad support across the palace. It was a reasonable sounding point, the kind of thing that would have carried weight in a different room at a different moment. Catherine let him finish, she nodded, and then she did something that people in that room still talk about. She agreed with him entirely. She said he was absolutely right. That institutional oversight was essential. That broad support was not just desirable, but necessary. And then she outlined, in precise detail, exactly how her proposed structure for the initiative built in every mechanism of oversight and collaboration that he had just described. As though she had anticipated his objection, word for word, and had prepared a response so thorough that raising the concern had actually strengthened her position rather than weakened it. The courtier had no follow-up. Nobody did. William, who had been present throughout, said very little. Those who know him well say this was entirely intentional. He understood what Catherine was doing, and he understood that the most useful thing he could do in that room was let her do it. This was not his moment to lead, it was hers. And his restraint, his willingness to sit back and allow her to own the room completely, was in its own way as significant as anything she said. The decision was reached without a formal vote. That is not how the palace does things. Instead, there was a moment where the person chairing the meeting looked around the room and registered the absence of any remaining objection. Then, said the words that Catherine had been working toward for the better part of 2 years. It was agreed that the Princess of Wales would take the lead. 11 words, delivered in the measured, understated tone that the British establishment reserves for moments that are actually enormous, but must never appear to be. 11 words that represented a fundamental shift in the internal architecture of royal influence. The reaction outside that room was swift. Among the external partners who had been waiting for clarity, there was undisguised relief. Several organizations that had been holding back full commitment to the initiative and were unwilling to invest deeply until the question of leadership was resolved immediately began moving forward. Phone calls were made. Plans that had been sitting in draft form for months were dusted off and put back into motion. Inside the palace, the reactions were more complicated. Some members of staff who had backed the wrong faction found themselves in the awkward position of having to recalibrate their loyalties without making the recalibration too obvious. The rival faction that had run the pressure campaign went quiet in the way that losing factions inside institutions always go quiet. Not graciously, just quietly, waiting to see what came next, calculating what the new landscape meant for their own positions. And then there was the broader royal family. Most reacted with what appeared to be genuine warmth. The careful relationship management Catherine had done in the weeks before the decision paid off clearly. There were no public signals of displeasure, no briefings to sympathetic journalists, no subtle distancing from the announcement. But there was one question that lingered in the corridors long after the meeting had ended. Not about whether Catherine had won. That was settled. The question being asked, quietly, by the people who understood what this moment actually meant, was something bigger, and something more unsettling for those who preferred the old order. If she could do this, what would she do next? What this means? Going forward. The dust had barely settled, the meeting was over, and the decision had been made. And yet inside the palace, nobody was acting like things had simply returned to normal, because they hadn't. Something fundamental had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Not everyone was willing to say it out loud, but they could feel it. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was no longer simply the future queen consort waiting patiently in the wings. She was something the palace had not quite seen before, a senior royal who had taken on one of the most significant institutional initiatives in recent memory. Not because it was handed to her. It was not because of her title or her proximity to the throne, but because she had outworked, outmaneuvered, and outlasted everyone else who had wanted it. That changes things. Permanently. Let's start with what it means for the initiative itself, because beyond all the palace politics, the power struggles, and the quietly dramatic meeting where everything was decided, there is still a program of work that needs to be delivered. Real outcomes for real communities. Children whose developmental trajectories will be shaped by whether this initiative succeeds or fails. Families who will either benefit from what gets built or not notice any difference at all, because good intentions dissolved into bureaucratic noise somewhere along the way. Catherine is acutely aware of this. People who work closely with her say it is the thing she returns to most often in private conversations about the initiative, not the politics or the institutional significance, but the outcomes. The actual human difference that the work is supposed to make. That focus, more than anything else, is what makes the people around her genuinely confident about what comes next. The external partners who had been holding back are now fully engaged. Organizations that had been cautiously enthusiastic are now openly committed. The kind of institutional momentum that is almost impossible to manufacture artificially is building naturally. Driven by the simple fact that the people involved believe in both the work and the person now leading it. Within the Royal Foundation, the effect is already visible. Teams that had been operating in a holding pattern, waiting for clarity on direction, are moving. The research that had been commissioned but not yet fully activated is being put to work. There is an energy in the organization that people inside it describe as qualitatively different from what was there 6 months ago. But the implications stretch well beyond the initiative itself. What Catherine has demonstrated through this entire process is a model of royal influence that is genuinely new. Not new in a revolutionary sense. It was not in a way that breaks with tradition or challenges the fundamental structures of the monarchy. New in a more subtle and in many ways more powerful sense. She has shown that it is possible to accumulate real institutional authority within the palace without relying on seniority, without political maneuvering in the traditional sense, and without the kind of public pressure campaigns that have damaged other members of the royal family when they tried to assert themselves. She did it through credibility, through relationships, and through the slow, unglamorous work of actually knowing what she was talking about. That is a template. And the people watching most closely inside the institution understand exactly what it means for the future. Because Catherine is not done. Those who know her well are careful about what they say publicly on this subject. But the picture that emerges from conversations with people close to her is of someone who sees this victory, not as an endpoint but as a foundation. The initiative she now controls is significant in its own right, but it is also connected to a broader vision. A vision for what the monarchy can and should be doing in the lives of ordinary people. Not symbolically, practically, there are conversations already happening, quietly, about how the framework being developed for this initiative might be applied to adjacent areas: education policy engagement, community mental health infrastructure, the intersection of early years development and economic mobility. These are not small ideas. They are the kinds of ideas that could reshape what royal philanthropy actually means in this country. And then there is the question of William, because any honest assessment of what this moment means has to reckon with what it says about the partnership at the center of the future monarchy. William and Catherine have always been described publicly as a team, but teams have dynamics. They have internal distributions of responsibility and influence that are not always visible from the outside. What this moment has made clear to anyone paying close attention is that this particular team is not a conventional one. This is not a future king and a supportive consort. This is two people who have divided the work of building the future monarchy between them, in a way that gives each of them genuine authority in their own domain. William leads on certain things, Catherine leads on others. And crucially, when Catherine leads, she leads completely, not as a deputy or as a representative, but as the principal. That is a significant statement about the kind of monarchy that is being built for the next generation. A monarchy where the queen consort is not a ceremonial addition to the king, but an equal partner in the actual work of the institution. For those inside the palace who are still adjusting to this new reality, the message is becoming harder to ignore with each passing week. The old assumptions do not apply anymore. The people who underestimated Catherine saw her patience as passivity and her quietness as lack of ambition, are now in the uncomfortable position of having to revise everything they thought they understood about her. That revision is not a comfortable process, particularly for those whose own positions depended on those assumptions remaining intact. But perhaps the most telling sign of how completely things have changed is this. The conversations that are now happening inside the palace are no longer about whether Catherine has the influence to drive major institutional change. That question has been answered definitively. The conversations now are about something else entirely, about how far she intends to go, about what she will turn her attention to next, about whether the people and structures around her are ready for what is coming. The palace has always been a place that moves slowly, deliberately, on its own time. Catherine just reminded everyone inside it that she moves on hers, and she is just getting started. Catherine did not storm the palace. She did not make demands. She did not fight loudly or publicly for what she wanted. Instead, she simply outworked everyone around her and stayed focused when everything was chaotic. She walked into the room already prepared when the moment finally came. That is not luck or timing. That is a woman who understood exactly what she was building and never lost sight of it through all the noise and the resistance and the waiting. The palace will never quite look at her the same way again. And honestly, it probably should not have underestimated her in the first place. If this story gave you something to think about, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. There is a lot more coming.